to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. This is episode number 560. My name is Camden Busey. I'm the pastor of Hope Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Grayslake, Illinois. I'm delighted to be back today with our good friend Glenn Clary. Glenn is the pastor of South Austin OPC. Nope. He's the pastor of Providence OPC in Pflugerville, Texas, just north of South Austin. Sorry about that, Glenn. Welcome back to the program. It's good to talk to you.
That's okay. That's okay. You could have confused me with someone much worse than Reverend Cassidy. Well, it's good to be back here with you, Kim.
Thank you very much. You know, maybe you participate in Jim, and Jim participates in you in some odd locale way. Wow. We got quite the episode today, don't we? And
certainly do.
It's a little bit unusual because we've already recorded the conversation, and we're gonna play it for you here in just a second. We recorded it just now, so it's not like you're hearing us talk a week later. So we're still kind of just in the aftermath of, well, that's a bad word. That has a bad connotation. We're still in the mix afterglow. That sounds even stranger. But we're having just very excited and delighted about the conversation we were able to have with a very special guest, Dr. Lawrence Feingold. Now, you might not know that name if you're not a Thomistic scholar, but Dr. Feingold is Associate Professor of Theology and Philosophy at Kenrick-Glennon Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. He's earned a doctorate in theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. And he's written a lot of books and articles, but he's written two books in particular that we're going to speak with him about. The first is brand new. It's the Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion, and that was published by Emmaus Academic in 2018. Yes. I like how you have your copy of the book. I'm looking. See, Second Commandment, I covered mine up for the video.
Oh. Oh, that's who that is. I didn't recognize him. So.
We'll see who's more pious. And secondly, wonderful book. I love this book. The Natural Desire to See God According to St. Thomas Aquinas and His Interpreters. This book was published in 2010 by Sapientia Press. And there's another book by Sapientia. It's also very excellent, by Dario Spezzano, on the subject of the Beatific Vision. Yes, very good. So today, we're talking to Dr. Feingold about the connection between these two things. Now, if people have been listening along to our programs of late, you know we have our conference coming up very soon, October 5th through 7th, 2018, here in Grayslake, Illinois. And our subject is Seeing God, the Deeper Protestant Conception, Aquinas, Barth, and Voss on the Beatific Vision. And so it makes sense for us to speak with a well-known and well-celebrated Catholic scholar who is an expert on Thomas Aquinas and is published on Thomas's view of the Beatific Vision. But what's quite interesting is his brand new book on the Eucharist is also right in that vein, because what Dr. Feingold's going to teach us is that for Thomas Aquinas, the metaphysics and theology and the philosophy, all of it, of his belief, is connected. There's some questions on that to come toward the end of the conversation. But the question is, what does it mean for us to see God? Well, for Thomas, it means that we return unto God as we have left Him when He created us. Excuse me. But we return unto God and we're reproportioned. And meaning we're deified or divinized by participating in the divine essence. Now, if you're wondering what in the world that means, you need to listen to the rest of the conversation to hear about that. Glenn, what would you say to introduce someone to this conversation and just kind of whet their appetite for what they're going to hear in just a minute?
Oh, it's an absolutely fascinating topic. I've been reading Feingold's two books. He's a very clear writer, by the way. These are really enjoyable books to read. And his book on the Eucharist is one of the best books I have on the subject. It covers the whole history of the Eucharist from biblical times through the patristic age.
And you have many.
Age.
That's saying something.
And I have many, and I've read many on the Eucharist. This is one of the better ones out there. It's a fantastic resource. So I do commend it to our listeners, encourage them to pick it up. He's presenting very clearly a Roman Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist, one that is in full continuity with the doctrines that you find in the Council of Trent, for example, and in Thomas Aquinas. And so that's his particular view on things. And so when he assesses the reformers and critiques the reformers, he's doing it from that Catholic perspective. So keep that in mind. But these are fascinating topics. It's really wonderful to study a theologian and philosopher like Thomas, who is a brilliant thinker, prolific writer, easy to read. I love reading Thomas. I loved reading his sermons on the Apostles' Creed, his commentary on the Gospel of John. You can find that online. Reading his Summa. He's really easy to read. But the topics we're focusing on the Beatific Vision, in particular, are so helpful to understand in order to grasp his system as a whole, and the differences between Roman Catholicism, the deeper Protestant conception, and modernism. Maybe the deeper modernist conception.
Exactly. That's the other side that Jim can inform us on. Right. Really important. So some information here, if you'd like to visit us online, reformedforum.org/events/conference, or if you're on the homepage or any of our pages, you can look at the events menu at the top of the website and head on over to the 2018 Theology Conference. If you'd like to come and discuss some of these things, this conference is still open. We're starting to fill up. My wife was telling me, my dear wife Erica, she handles a lot of this registration, and we're starting to push the limits of our church auditorium. So registration has been very strong. People are going to be coming, so we'd love to have more, but you need to act soon. Because I don't know, we might end up selling out. That would be quite the experience. But we're going to be speaking about all of these issues. We've got a lot in store, and I hope that people would understand that we're not trying to present some sort of idiosyncratic view, or that we as Vantillians somehow just have a giant axe to grind with Thomas and therefore can't read or interpret him correctly. So I think in many ways that we, having Dr. Feingold on, have been, I hope, would be vindicated to some degree on this regard. And we need to get down to the issue, and we need to read Thomas for what Thomas says, and not read him, through the eyes of Van Til, or read him through the eyes of other Protestants, or through the eyes of other people. And that goes also for Dr. Feingold. But what we can find with Feingold's writings is that I believe that he's treating Thomas very fairly, and bringing to the fore some important and foundational aspects of Thomas's theology and philosophy for us. And again, there's great differences between us on some important points of doctrine that comes through in the interview. So please spare your comments that say, I thought this was Reformed Forum, not Catholic Forum. Well, it is, but we never promised at Reformed Forum to only speak to Reformed people, but to speak to theologians and people who are going to help sharpen us in our understanding and make us better theologians and followers of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So we believe this conversation with Dr. Lawrence Feingold is going to do just that. So with that, I'll head on over and play the recording. So I hope you enjoy it, and get a hold of us if you'd like to follow up. reformedforum.org. Well, Dr. Feingold, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us today and taking time out of your teaching and your family schedule to speak with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're very much interested today to speak about the connection between the Beatific Vision and the Eucharist in the theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. There are a lot of people, perhaps in our tradition, who don't want to acknowledge the connection there. We're hoping to plumb those depths today to demonstrate that they're all part of a whole, that there's a very organic and cohesive nature to Thomas's theology and philosophy on all aspects. You can't just parcel him out loci by loci. But to get at that, I think it might be helpful for us to speak about some basic and fundamental issues so that we can approach the subject correctly. And I was wondering, Larry, if you could speak to us about the exitus and reditus structure or plan. Pardon my Latin pronunciation. I didn't do well in Latin.
Yeah.
But anyway, speaking about the basic structure, because understanding that is helpful for not only understanding Thomas, but the tradition. And certainly when we approach the Beatific Vision, we need to understand those things in order to see the big picture of what God is doing.
Right. So St. Thomas Aquinas structures his great mature work, the Summa of Theology, around that fundamental idea, going out from God and returning back to God. And so the first part of the Summa looks at God and creation going out from God, but all the rest of it, by far the greater part, has to do with the return back to God, and that being through the moral life, through the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and through, obviously, Christ. So that begins the third part of the Summa as the bridge, the mediator between God and man, and then he treats the sacraments right after that as a continuation of Christ's humanity, to bring us back to our source, but to bring us back precisely seeing him face to face. And so the work would have ended with the last things. So that's the overarching plan. And I think that's key for understanding, just God's plan in general, but for understanding the sacraments and the Eucharist in particular. Right? So the Eucharist also has that same structure.
Very good.
The Lord comes down to us to encounter us in the Eucharist, but so that we can be brought back to him. And that, I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Oh, sure.
That would be the aspect of the Mass as sacrifice, which I suppose it would be a point of difficulty for
for us
in the Reformed tradition.
Indeed, yes. These are some
Right.
foundational issues, and we can speak as scholars together and as people seeking the big picture here, but also realizing that there's some incongruencies between our statement of faith and that of the Roman Catholic Church. No doubt. I was a member of the CTSA for several years. I just didn't keep up with my dues the last year, so I had to politely decline. But I've very much enjoyed my interactions with Catholic theologians, and it's always been sharpening. And sometimes we try to, I find that there are certain people that would try to maybe sugarcoat the differences, but I find it's much more helpful to get down to the core issues and speak deeply about these foundational issues so that we can, move forward. That's a more fruitful form of dialogue, I find. So I'm hoping
I agree.
That we're absolutely going to do that today. You spoke about the we would say the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, but the Mass as a sacrifice and how that's such an important point of our return unto God here in the Thomistic scheme. But even before that, I was wondering if you could speak to us in big pictures about Christ's presence. Why does Christ want to be present in the first place? Because that helps us understand the nature and perhaps the telos or goal of the Eucharist in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So it's the same logic. So you mentioned before the unity. It seems to me that it's so important to see the unity of the different mysteries of the faith. And so here what we're talking about is the unity between the Incarnation and the Eucharist. And then we can later connect it to the mystery of the Beatific Vision. So the Eucharist and the Incarnation have the same logic, and the idea would be that the Eucharist prolonging the logic, and not just the logic, but the human presence of the Word incarnate throughout the life of the Church, so that we can continue to encounter him. And so obviously, well, let me take a step back. Of the sacraments, one of the medieval theologians made a connection between the sacraments and the fundamental virtues. And so the Eucharist gets connected with charity there, as baptism is with faith. And so the Eucharist as the sacrament of charity, spousal charity in the sense of self-giving love.
Right, caritas.
And
right?
It's of a spousal kind, right? So Christ comes as the bridegroom of his church. And so it makes sense that when the bridegroom is going to leave his bride with his physical human presence, first in the crucifixion, but then 40 days later in the ascension, after the resurrection, it makes sense that he would want to remain with his bride at the same time as leaving her. Right? So I think it's really important to look at the fittingness of this. He wants to remain, but it's better for us if he goes, he tells us.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also better if he be able to remain, but to remain in a way proper to a bride who's still in exile. Right? So we're a bride, the church, exiled still from the Lord, walking by faith. And so it's fitting that he remain with us, with his human presence, as a bridegroom with his bride, but in such a way that we're still walking by faith and not by sight. So that would be the logic behind the real presence.
And this would be a presence
Mm-hmm.
that is, in a sense, advanced. It is greater than his historical presence on earth during his earthly ministry, correct? There's still an advance. It's not quite
Greater
the Beatific Vision yet. Yeah.
Right. So greater in one sense, I would say in one sense, not as satisfying. Like, so it's not as satisfying because the apostles could see him and touch him. Mary Magdalene could kiss his feet, and we can't. So in that sense, it's. So I want to say three things. It's less satisfying in that sense because we can't see; he's veiled. It's the same presence because we believe that he's present with the same humanity that was conceived in Mary's womb and nailed to the cross and rose. But better in a third way, because when he walked the streets of Galilee and Jerusalem, he could only be in one place and thus only encountered by few people and only some at a time and then others at another time. And so he devised a way of being present to his bride that really respected the nature, the universal nature of the bride that he wanted her to be in all places and times and cultures. So in the Eucharist, he's devised a kind of presence which is the same presence, the same humanity, veiled, so in that sense, less satisfying to us, but more perfect because mysteriously capable of encountering us wherever there's a tabernacle and the Blessed Sacrament. Right, so that would be the Catholic understanding of the deep fittingness of the real presence.
Mm-hmm.
It's spousal love. The first requirement of spousal love would be to dwell with the beloved and to share love. So I say it continues the logic of the Incarnation, right? Because that was part of the fittingness of the Word becoming flesh in the first place.
Absolutely. So along those lines then, I'd like to speak more specifically about the Eucharist and focusing in on your book before we connect it back to the earlier book, the latest book here, the Eucharist. Very much like how you laid this out. It's very organized. You say you're writing, in essence, a textbook of sorts for your students. And I'm curious how this informed some of your decisions in the way that you structured and organized the book. You've divided it into 4 points. Or 4 parts. Okay, I'm wondering, could you describe those parts to us and how those rightly flow forth from the way Thomas and the Catholic tradition treats this issue?
Great question. So the book has 4 parts, but in the title I only mentioned 3. So I'm going to start with the 3 that I mentioned.
Yeah.
So the title is The Eucharist Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion. And so of the 4 parts, 3 of them are those: presence, sacrifice, and communion. And so that's the second, third, and fourth parts of the book. And that corresponds to a question that I raised in the first part, which is, why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? And that's just as a general method. That's how St. Thomas usually begins treating a certain part of theology. So let's say the Incarnation. And the first question would be, why? Why did God want to become man? Right? And then from that answer to the why, you can then come to understand and structure the treatise. So that's what I've done here. Why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? And so my claim is for 3 reasons. It's the sacrament of love, spousal love, so to be with the beloved, real presence. But spousal love does another thing. Spousal love gives oneself. The husband is called sometimes always to give himself for the beloved, and sometimes to the point of shedding one's blood. So Jesus sheds his blood for us on Calvary and wants to prolong that sacrifice. So that'll be the second part
Oh, yeah.
the Mass as the quote-unquote prolongation, or the mystery of making his sacrificial love for his bride present. And that's a gift to the Father. So that's what I call the ascending dimension of the Eucharist. But he gives himself not only for the beloved, but also to the beloved. And that's the dimension of communion. And in giving himself to the beloved, he also makes it possible for his bride, the church, to have communion among the members. So it's the sacrament of vertical communion with God, but also of ecclesial communion. And so the second, third, and fourth parts deal with the second part, the presence, the mystery of presence, and that's the foundation, right? So I'll explain probably later on, that we couldn't have the same sacrifice as Calvary if we didn't have the same victim on the altar.
Oh, sure, right.
And thus we need his presence. So the presence is the secret to the sacrifice, and it's also the secret to communion, because we receive and we believe that very same victim who was born for us, died for us, and rose for us.
Well,
and he
very
gives
good.
us his humanity so that we can have a greater share of his divinity. Then the first part is laying the foundations.
Right.
And that would be the sources in the Old Testament and the New Testament, Old Testament figures, the New Testament texts, and the treatment of the fathers. And then the matter and form of the sacrament. In other words, why Jesus instituted it in the way that he did.
Very good.
So that's the plan of the book.
Well, thank you very much. Larry, you talk about, you have a lot of material in the book on the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is a very, very complex doctrine. And one of the things that I found most helpful about the book, about that particular section of the book, is you explaining the difference between the doctrine of transubstantiation as understood by Thomas and defined dogmatically by the Church, how that is different than a physicism approach to Christ being locally present. I wonder if you can flesh that out for us. No pun intended, but maybe flesh that out for us today.
That's obviously a crucial point. So the disciples in Capernaum in John 6 didn't understand that point, right? And so many left him saying, this is a hard saying. And they left him presumably because they understood him to be speaking about eating him in such a way that they would be chewing part from part. And so clearly Jesus, so we want to say Jesus is truly present in his true humanity, but not present in the way that a piece of meat can be dismembered and masticated. And this has to do with what I was mentioning before about he's present with the same humanity, but in a better way, in a way that enables him to be present to all of us, and in an inexhaustible way. In other words, in a way by which we can receive him, not just a piece of him, but the whole of him. So he's present with the whole of him in wherever there's a consecrated Eucharist, and he's thus, therefore, can be received with the whole of him. So that would be the
no, that's very helpful.
Faith in that presence. So transubstantiation would be the way that he devised to become present in that better way. And so here we make a distinction. So we need to make use of the distinction, the Aristotelian distinction, between substance and accidents, but we can simply present in terms of common sense the appearances of a thing.
Right. But that substantial presence of Christ is absolutely necessary for the second part of, or the second purpose of the sacrament to be fulfilled, and that is sacrifice.
Right.
And also for communion, too. Another one of the most helpful parts of your book was the concept of sacrifice as returning something to God that came from God. And I think that fits in very very well with this doctrine of exitus and reditus. All things come from God and all things return to God. And understanding the sacrifice of Christ as the supreme event of reditus, Christ offering himself back to the Father, to me is just fascinating. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So we proceed out from God, right? But God made us so that we can return to him through human acts, right? And so those human acts would be acts of love, ultimately, self-donation. In other words, God has made us through a free, gratuitous gift of love. He's then, once he's made us, he's given himself totally to us in the incarnation, and we believe also in the Eucharist. But the logic of love is that the self-donation be mutual. Now, obviously here, it can't be equal, but mutual doesn't have to mean equal. It can be proportionate. In other words, God gives himself to us in a divine way, the incarnation, the passion, the Eucharist, and we're to give ourselves back to him in a way proportionate to our weakness. And that's, I think humanity has always understood that we're called to give something back, and that's what we're called to give back. We could sum up with really the purposes of prayer, and to adore him. That would be the first thing, to give back, simply acknowledging his glory, and then thanking him for everything that he's given us. And then also expressing our contrition or sorrow at having offended him, and seeking to give something back to restore his glory that we've detracted and obscured, made less visible by sin. And so sacrifice has always been understood, I think, by the religions of the world as a way by which we seek to do that incredibly imperfectly, to offer some token of that. And so human beings left to themselves, our sacrifice is always going to be infinitely imperfect. And so that's one of the reasons for the incarnation, is that Christ came so that he could offer the perfect sacrifice, in which the victim is worthy, having the same dignity as the offended party, the Father. The victim gives him back totally with nothing held back out of the most perfect love. And so Christ's sacrifice is the one true sacrifice that gives back, that returns what ought to be returned. All right, so Christ does it for us. But again, if you want to give a gift to someone, the best gift is to help the recipient give back. Right? And so Christ wanted to give us a sacrifice in which he's not the only offerer.
Right.
I think this is really important. In other words, Christ makes the perfect offering for us because he's our head. And he makes that offering, he made that offering on Calvary as our head on all of our behalf. But he also wanted us to join in the offering. And for one thing, we weren't there at Calvary, but even if we were there at Calvary, the offering would have, he wanted all humanity to join in that offering and to continually be able to offer a more perfect offering of ourselves, of our life. And so then the Mass understood as sacrifice is a twofold offering. Christ being offered to the Father, the same as Calvary, except that he doesn't die again. Maybe we'll come back to that point. He's now glorious.
Right.
But there's this difference that we get to join in and offer our Christian life with him.
As an act of reditus. That's part of the reditus, the return.
That's right.
Yeah.
As an act of, and so in the Eucharist, understood as sacrifice, we can see there are two things being offered: the infinite perfect victim, Jesus Christ, and he's present there to be offered through the real presence that we just spoke about.
Yeah.
But there's also our addition, which we're joining, as it were, and our addition is finite and imperfect, but it's valuable. to the Father, even though it's finite and imperfect compared to. But the beauty is we get to join it together, and that it be offered simultaneously with the perfect offering. Right? So that's the logic behind which the Catholic tradition has understood the Mass as a sacrifice.
Sure, and
it's above all Christ's sacrifice, but it's our joining into it with our lives.
Yeah, and then it.
In other words, everything.
Well, then it returns us back within the understanding that God created us, created human beings, as man made in His image, and so we proceed from Him in a sense. I'm not using that in a Trinitarian way, although that's not unrelated because of the processions of the persons of the Trinity. But we go out from God, exitus, and then through the work of Christ, then can now return to Him, ultimately and consummately in the Beatific Vision. It definitely is a very cohesive system, and it seems to me to make sense that Thomas's metaphysic and his philosophy here are clearly informing his sacramentology, that these two are not separable. Yeah. There's often a problem with, or a misunderstanding, I should say, of Protestants, misunderstanding the Catholic teaching on sacrifice and caricaturizing it as a constant re-sacrificing, that every time the Mass is observed that Christ is sacrificed again. But that's not precisely correct, at least in my understanding and in reading the Catechism and others. And yeah, exactly. Many Catholics laugh at that, but I'm telling you, this gets repeated all the time. So it's my charge often in teaching on this to say, well, Catholics do not teach this. They teach X, Y, and Z. But it's really important that we would understand as well the unity of that act of consecration and the participation in the Eucharist with the historical event of the once for all sacrifice of Christ. What are the philosophical? I know it's a broad word, but what are the underpinnings? The logic of how are we caught up with this once for all historical event? Because it's not a repetition of the event, but it's the event we're there presently, in a way, when we participate.
Right. So this is one of the most difficult and beautiful questions about Eucharistic theology, that we want to say it's the same sacrifice as Calvary, but not in every way, and therefore it doesn't involve. So the Council of Trent that kind of encapsulated the Catholic teaching on this speaks of it as the same because we've got the same victim. And so it's resting on the doctrine of the real presence. So if Christ becomes present on the altar where he wasn't in his humanity, now we have the same victim. And we also have the same priest because Christ is the one eternal high priest. And so he acts through his ministers. So we've got the same priest and victim in every Mass as on Calvary. And we have the same intentions because Christ today, as then, is equally animated with his love for the glory of his Father and with his love for the bride, us, the church. And so the same intention to offer himself for the glory of God the Father and for the redemption of the sins of his bride and the application of the merits that he's won for us in Calvary to us today. So we could say the same intentions. But it differs in that, as the letter to Hebrews says, he, having died once, he dies no more. And therefore he is not killed again in the Mass. Right? So his death takes place once only 2,000 years ago. And his presence now is that of his glorious risen humanity in the Eucharist. Right? So he becomes present in the Eucharist as he now is. But nevertheless, he's willed to sacramentally represent the moment of his bloody death in every Mass. And that's why he chose to institute the Eucharist under the appearances of bread and wine, which represent and become the substance of his body and blood. So on Calvary, his blood got physically separated from his body, bringing about his death, as any sacrificial victim would be. In the Mass, he dies no more physically, but he's sacramentally represented the separation of his blood from his body by having a dual consecration, first of the bread into his body and then of the wine into his blood. So sacramentally, in other words, under the sacramental signs, he's represented his bloody death, but it's not physically repeated. And there's a general principle in sacramental theology that the sacraments do what they represent, but mysteriously. And so if his passion is represented sacramentally, it's made present really, but again, in some more perfect way. So just as we said his presence is real, it's the same humanity, but in some sense more perfect, because without the limitation of being only one place and therefore not another, here too his death is made present, but without the limitation of being crucified again. His death is made present in the way proper to an historical event. Now that's mysterious. Other historical events can't be present in many times. They happen once, and because they have a finite effect. And yes, part of their effect can be made present later, but just a part of a finite value. But because Christ is God and man, all the deeds that he did in his humanity are deeds of the second person of the Trinity, and thus with an infinite power and efficacy, and unlimited. And if that's true of all of the deeds of Christ's life, how much more of the most central deed of shedding all his blood for love for us? So since that act, Christ's passion, is the act of a divine person in his humanity, it's an act that can't be limited in its power and efficacy to one time and place, and thus transcends it, and therefore can be applied throughout history to our present in every moment of the Church's life.
You were just mentioning the application of the death of Christ to us. I wonder if you can comment then on the effects of the Eucharist on the faithful who receive it and communion with Christ.
Okay. Well, before I even go there, there's a twofold effect of the celebration of the sacrifice of the Mass. So, and I'm going to use again the Exodus Reditus language. There's an ascending effect and a descending, we could say. So the ascending effect of every time the Mass is celebrated is that there's a glorification of God being given, principally because Jesus Christ himself is offering himself, not dying again, right? Not he died only once, but he's truly present on the altar, and he's present precisely as the victim of Calvary, who's died for our sins and risen. So he's present offering himself, and that gives God an infinite glory. But it's also the fitting occasion for God to send graces down upon the earth. So this is why the Mass has always been offering the sacrifice of the Mass is seen as obviously God is free, but there's a fittingness to him bestowing in abundance graces on our very needy, thirsty world. So that's graces that come to the world. In other words, come to people perhaps not present at that Mass. The grace of conversion coming to someone who is far away on the occasion of that Mass being offered. That would be one kind of effect we could call the ascending glorification. But then there's the second fruit, and that's precisely Holy Communion. And so here's the fittingness that we received the same victim that has just been offered. So now we can speak about Holy Communion. And so the Christian life, we speak about Exodus and Reditus, but in reality, it's maybe it's better a spiral, because it continuously comes around again. In other words, we've come out from God, but he's giving, and he gives himself to us so that we can give ourselves back, but we don't do it perfectly. And so he comes to us again, and we give ourselves back to him again. And so I like to speak of the Eucharistic life. The Eucharistic life as a life in which day after day, week after week, Christ we offer him for the glory of the Father, to the Father. We offer the Son to the Father and ourselves with him. And then we receive from the Father the same Son. And he feeds us with better dispositions, so that tomorrow, next week, I'll be able to offer myself, hopefully better, with a better Christian life.
Yeah, as a living sacrifice, like Paul says in Romans 12.
And so it's right. So it goes. So that's why I like the image of a spiral, or simply a cycle of exodus and redditus, of descending. So God, the descending movement would be God coming down to us, and that would be first the real presence. Well, even before that, His Word. So His Word coming to us, the liturgy of the Word. Then Him coming to us with His presence on the altar. But then there's an ascending movement, and that's our offering Him and ourselves with Him. And then He offers Himself to us now, totally, in Holy Communion. But there's this principle in a metaphysical principle: everything is received according to the mode of the receiver. And so that means that even though I'm receiving the infinite victim, Jesus Christ, I'm still receiving Him very imperfectly because of the imperfection of my heart. But His goal is to expand the mode of the receiver day by day.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why it's fitting that we receive. Yeah.
I had a question for you on that exact point, wondering at what point does the process or the activity of reproportioning occur? Because does this happen at the point of a person's having faith in Christ and then participating in the Mass? Does one begin to be reproportioned toward God at that moment, or is the reproportioning something that mostly happens in a moment, toward the end of the Christian life, either upon death or upon Christ's return? How are we to understand that, metaphysically speaking?
So no, not. We want to. The reproportioning has to take place. Should.
Yeah.
In God's plan, take place earlier.
Yeah.
In fact, at the very
beginning. That was my understanding.
Of life.
Right.
In other words, the whole. Right. So the whole of this life is an opportunity for us already now to be living a human divine life. That's what it means. That's how we understand being in a state of grace, or being justified. Right? So being justified enables us already now to live a life in which we're sharing, obviously infinitely imperfectly, but in His knowledge through faith, and in His love through the theological virtue of love or charity.
Certainly.
And so, yes, it's got to, but it's meant, since we're participating, we are finitely participating in infinite love. Our participation is never going to exhaust. That's the understatement, the greatest possible understatement.
Yeah, right.
Right. In other words, no matter how much we grow, there's infinitely more for us to grow. And so the idea is that the whole of this life would be the time of a continually better proportioning with the infinitely disproportionate God. Right? And so Jesus Christ's humanity as the bridge, because His humanity is the perfect participation in His divinity. Yeah, so sharing the divine life, we're sharing in what Jesus' own humanity most perfectly shared. And so how fitting it is that the fundamental principle of feeding us with His divine life be feeding us with His flesh. In other words, with His humanity that had the perfect participation, and still has the perfect participation in His divinity.
And so that's a definition of divinization or deification, correct?
Right. So sharing in the divine life, which has to begin with the forgiveness of original and grave personal sin, which would be incompatible with that divine life. And so it begins in a particular moment, right? So the baptism of a baby, the justification of an adult, but it's then meant to grow, right? So we grow in our participation in that divine life, and hopefully in a kind of with increasing velocity, although it often seems that the exact opposite is happening.
Sure.
Right, so that would be the the call of the Christian life. Because the more we participate, the more we become capable of participating still more. That would be the spiral idea. Or we could say vital circle.
So along those lines, maybe to speak and connect a little, this has already been connected several times over. So, and I'm still fascinated with everything you have to say, but to connect it a little bit more explicitly for our listeners to the earlier book on the natural desire to see God, according to St. Thomas Aquinas and his interpreters. Can you speak to us about, that's a very technical phrase, a natural desire. It's not just thrown out there. You're speaking about a very specific issue that arose with Henri de Lubac and others that really raised this issue. But here's the big question then. In what way do humans, as created, desire that reditus, desire that spiral and that possibility of seeing God? And not only in what way, but I mean, and how does that develop? Is it there at present? Is it some sort of thing to strive for? I'm curious to begin, discussing a little more of the basics of that natural desire.
Okay. Right. So it's Thomas Aquinas throws that out, that concept, in various articles where he speaks about what is perfect beatitude. And so he uses that and the notion of a natural desire to answer that question. So a lot of things to say here, and hard to separate them all out. So
sure.
On the one hand, so there's a huge debate about what exactly. So St. Thomas comes out with this thesis that perfect happiness can only lie in the vision of God, because there's a natural desire for it, and if that desire is frustrated, we can't be perfectly happy in the sense that all desire is met. So that's kind of how he lays it out in one of his articles. But he describes this desire in rather intellectual terms, and he gives the example of so we all have the natural desire to know the causes and essences of things, right? And so the 3-year-old with their question why, you can see that a 3-year-old has a natural desire to know and is not satisfied with knowing particulars. He wants to know their causes and the causes of their causes, etc. And this desire can only come to rest in knowing the very first cause, God, and the very final end, God, the first truth, the first beauty. But even knowing that there is a God, the desire doesn't come to rest because we want to know him as he is.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know him in his essence. And the problem is all of our knowledge in this life falls short of that, and in fact, infinitely. Because yes, we can know that there is a God through reason. We can know things about God, that he's perfect and that he's the truth, but I can't know the way that he's the truth because I'm still knowing him through the imperfect. And so I can know that he's beauty with a capital B, but when I think about that, I'm just going to think about the finite beauties that I've seen and say he's better than that. So I can't know him as he is, and I desire that, right? And so that's how he lays out this natural desire. And it may be that most people aren't thinking about this, and that would be obviously a bad thing. So we want to say, on the one hand, everyone naturally desires this in some sense. If they were to think about it, they would naturally desire. In other words, if they were to consider, yes, wouldn't it be good to see beauty with a capital B, the ultimate? Plato talks about this in his dialogues. For example, in the Symposium, there's a beautiful interchange between Socrates and the priestess Diotima, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, in which she kind of poses that question to Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
What would it be like to see beauty unveiled, beauty with a capital B, the very idea of beauty? And so that's the natural desire to see God that comes up in that dialogue of Plato. But yes, for most people, it's dormant. They're not thinking about it, right? They're seeking other things.
Sure.
Now, so that's why it's really important to consider this desire as something that needs to be woken up in people.
Mm.
And that's part of the very vocation, I would say, of philosophy and theology, to wake up that desire in people, and of preaching. Right? That's the goal of preaching, to enkindle that desire. Now, once we have it woken, it still has various stages. And so it'll exist in a different way in someone like Socrates, who doesn't know about revelation, than in somebody who has Christian faith and knows that Christ has promised that we will see him as he is. And so it becomes hope. So the virtue of hope is the natural desire to see God as it exists in those with Christian faith. But even there's a place for growth, because somebody who doesn't yet have love enkindled will desire it less, obviously, and in a less perfect way. I might desire it as my perfection. But when love is kindled, we desire to see God for his glory. And so that, and the more we love him, the more we ought to desire seeing God's glory, justice, mercy, love, etc. And so there's no end to how much it should grow in us. So that's kind of my thesis, is that it's something that's elicited by considering this good of seeing God. It's changed by faith that it's possible and that it's promised to us in Christ, and then it grows by the more we love him.
You raise up an issue here, a rather large debate among many Thomistic scholars, and that's what Thomas actually means by natural desire. You say, here are the two options. It's either an elicited act of the will following on natural knowledge of the good, or it's a natural appetite as found in lower nature prior to any knowledge. It's more of an innate appetite. Why is that an important debate? And what are some of the consequences of either view? And what stand do you take? And why do you think that's significant?
Right. Yeah, great question. So these articles of St. Thomas where he speaks about this were commented on by Thomas, and then there was a kind of a rival interpretation by Scotists and those in the Franciscan tradition.
Yeah.
And so it became the subject of debate for 7 centuries. So we find a debate in the time of Scotus, and it gets rekindled in the 16th century. And so it was a huge debate in the 16th and 17th centuries. It then maybe went somewhat more dormant, and it burst out again in the 20th century in a whole series of articles by various Thomists on this. And at the peak of that kind of early 20th century debate, Henri de Lubac made the debate get even more passionate on both sides. And so the two sides of this debate have to do with two technical terms that are hard to explain, but which you just mentioned. Whether this debate is whether this desire is something elicited by knowledge. So that's why it's called an elicited desire. A desire that is drawn out by reflecting on God and the fact that he's not yet, that he's hidden from me. In other words, that there is a God who's the first truth, beauty, and goodness, and I want to see him, but he's hidden. As long as we walk in pilgrimage in this life. So I side with that claim, that it's a desire that's drawn out by considering that there is a first beauty, goodness, who's hidden for us. The other side of the debate would say it's simply an innate desire, the desire for God, because God made us for himself. So that St. Augustine gets quoted at the beginning of the Confessions, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you, and with which I entirely agree, of course. But nevertheless, the desire often gets interpreted as something simply written into our being because we are made in his image and likeness.
Sure.
And that is true. I want to also agree with that. Absolutely. Okay. The desire is in us because we're made in his image and likeness. But what I think, if you consider it as an innate desire, just simply written into us, it could be interpreted as if it were something like gravity, just simply pulling us to God in a way that wouldn't be fitting to our nature. And so our nature is one in which our desires, you can't love what you don't know. And so our properly human loves presuppose knowledge, knowing about the good. And that's why a higher knowledge, that of faith, gives this desire new power and force. So I think it's important that we understand this desire as brought about by knowledge, because again, it's a desire proper to a human being as a human being, and therefore proper to a human being here as someone capable of receiving faith, and actually receiving it, and therefore hoping in this, seeing God in a way proper to someone who's received God's own promise that He will bring us there if we don't.
Well, there's so many
obstinate to the end.
So many themes here that I found. I did my doctoral work on Karl Rahner, and I'm not at all connecting you to Rahner here, so don't be offended if that's the case. I know our mutual acquaintance Matthew Levering. We have a mutual distaste of Rahner that's I think equal. But I very much appreciate Rahner's what he's developing. I disagree very sharply with his conclusions, but the questions he asks are often very useful. But he has so many themes there that are so interesting and similar regarding something he calls the Vorgriff auf Esse, the pre-apprehension of being, or probably even more specifically something he calls the supernatural existential. But it's this idea that human beings, as created human beings, are basically the divinely intended recipient of God's communication of self. And so we're created specifically to receive God's self-communication. And so it's interesting for me to compare Rahner to many of these themes in Thomas. And of course, Rahner is very much working with Thomas as well, although he kind of hijacks it with some existentialist philosophy. But I was heading somewhere with this. A great concern for Rahner.
Jump in there?
A great concern for Rahner is maintaining God's freedom. He has to maintain human freedom and divine freedom at the same time. So he wants to make sure that this mutual, this communion between them is not an obligation of either side. And that's something you write about in the book too. And because there is a concern among some scholars that if human beings do have this natural desire to see God, if it's built in or innate in some way, that every single human has it by virtue of or they're created, and if human beings are an exitus from God with an intended reditus, would that not compromise for some the gratuitousness of God and perhaps even the supernatural order? In other words, just for the listeners, does that obligate God to save everyone if they're a legitimate human being, a human being?
Yeah, great question. It's a complicated question.
Sure.
It would be difficult to make the answer. So Rahner would actually pull more on the so I find myself rather strongly disagreeing with his take on this question.
Sure.
But we have one thing in common, which he just mentioned, the desire to save the gratuitousness. So let me backtrack a little bit. Rahner enters into this debate, Karl Rahner, by responding to Henri de Lubac's proposal.
In Sur Naturel?
Let me say something about in Sur Naturel. So de Lubac, so he loved this notion of the natural desire to see God, and so he greatly highlighted and emphasized it, but he sees it very much as an innate desire, a desire written into us at our creation, and a desire that gives us an unconditional movement to the Beatific Vision. From the start, it seems. So I wanted to, so my criticism of that view of de Lubac, so before I get to Rahner, is that I very much agree with seeing the importance of the natural desire to see God. But I think it's a mistake to view it simply as from the start, this unconditional written in, because it doesn't seem to give enough space to the elements of growth that I was trying to mention earlier. And secondly, by speaking of it as natural, and yet we seem to overlook a natural disproportionality that we have with God. Right? So how could we, as infinitely, as finite, infinitely distant in nature, have an innate desire for the supernatural without the supernatural already having been given to us through justification? Right, so that's kind of one of the problems. In other words, yes, after we're justified by baptism, and after we receive faith and hope and love, then yes, now it is not totally disproportionate. because once we have the divine life in us, then it makes sense that there would be an innate movement on our part, as well as an elicited movement to the Beatific Vision. So that's kind of the problem that Rahner jumps in on. So Rahner wrote an essay 4 years after de Lubac's Sur Naturel, and the same year that magisterial document, Humani Generis, came out, criticizing de Lubac for compromising the gratuitousness of grace with his idea that God couldn't make us not for anything less than the Beatific Vision,
right.
because from the start, according to de Lubac, that's written inscribed in us as our finality. So Rahner said, no, the Pius the 12th is right in criticizing Henri de Lubac for compromising gratuitousness, but de Lubac would be very much right to insist that we concretely have this unconditional desire from the beginning.
Right.
It's just that it shouldn't be considered to be natural. We should consider it right from the start, and therefore before baptism, to be in us by a kind of grace. And that's where he uses this strange expression, the supernatural as existential,
exactly,
to explain that. In other words, right. So right from the beginning of our existence, from conception, we're already not just natural beings, but we're already given this supernatural as existential, which gives us the desire to see God in this unconditional way that de Lubac spoke about. Now, I have a problem with both of them. Right? So my problem with de Lubac, I think I already mentioned, but my problem with Karl Rahner is that he's giving us this proportionality with the divine life and this unconditional movement that doesn't need to be ignited by baptism and faith. And so he's not given, so we can reconnect this to our earlier discussion of the sacraments and the Eucharist. He's given us something that's properly given to us by the sacraments. Rahner is assigning it to us at our conception. And I think there's a huge problem with that.
Sure.
For all kinds of reasons. I mean, original sin being the first, but then the whole meaning of the Christian life, and therefore the importance of receiving explicit faith and hope, and of the sacramental life as nourishing and changing, modifying this natural desire, making it from something that was purely elicited and maybe a wish. It would be nice to see God if such a thing were possible, but I have no reason to think it's possible if I'm an atheist. To making it an absolute desire once I come to recognize that God has promised to me, and then giving it an innate force once I'm given the divine life in justification. So Rahner's way of understanding this rightly criticized, I think, one aspect of de Lubac's teaching, but totally missed key elements of the Christian mystery, and particularly the importance of the sacraments in giving us progressively a share in the divine life.
Now,
and therefore nourishing the natural desire to see God in us day by day.
Yeah, we don't want to keep you too long because we're already ran you over the time that we committed to. We don't have to go anywhere, so I just want to give you the freedom if you need to get going. But if not, then I would like to ask at least maybe
fine.
two more.
I don't have any.
Okay.
I'm free for the rest of the afternoon.
Okay, well, we don't want to take the whole afternoon, even though we could, and we'd like to talk to you. On that point, I'm curious because one of the sharper differences that we can find with theological anthropology between the Reformed tradition and the Catholic tradition on this has to do with image of God, but specifically with the Donum superadditum. And so I would very much be interested to learn from you here. At what point do you see the Donum fitting in with regard to this natural desire, and how? I know these are enormous questions, but how do the sacraments then perhaps fulfill a place originally intended for the Donum? It was lost at the fall, but now the sacraments are given as a way for us to be reproportioned and proceed in that reditus back to God.
Reordered.
Great question. Yeah. So man in God's original plan in the garden was created in His image and likeness, and some of the fathers, like Origen, see that not just as a Semitic parallelism, but the fact that we're said to be made in His image and likeness. Two levels of image and likeness. nature and grace, right? So that would be, and then St. Thomas kind of really develops that with his, right? So St. Thomas, I could say, gives the kind of the most complete explanation of those two levels of being in God's image. And so we're in his image simply by having reason and free will and the capacity to know the truth and to love and to have conscience and self-determination. But we're much more in his likeness by sharing in his knowledge through faith, hoping in him as our final end with, in an unconditional way, in a firm, efficacious way, made possible by faith, and then sharing in his love. Right? So being in a state of grace would be the likeness that Adam and Eve were created in originally restored. All right, and so Christ came to repair man, restoring the supernatural likeness to his wounded image. And the means, the principal means, that we could say the ordinary means by which he does that are the sacraments of the new covenant. Right? And so baptism being in the beginning, so the justification coming to us. Not that God can't, now we don't want to say that God can't work outside the sacramental order. And thanks be to God, we believe that he does. And that would be where desire can bring about, can anticipate his grace being applied even before sacraments are received. But nevertheless, the sacraments remain the, we could say, the ordinary way by which that likeness is restored progressively. Right? So beginning in baptism, but then culminating with the Eucharist. And the fact that the Eucharist is frequently received being a way of being constantly nourished in that divine life. And so St. Thomas' beautiful article on why 7 sacraments. So here too, another difference. But and he sees, so his answer goes along the lines, well, in our natural life, we have many needs in our natural life. So it makes sense that in our life of grace, in our supernatural life, we have more than one need. Our first need to be born, but then we need to move and grow to maturity. We need to be nourished. We need to be healed if we've gotten sick, and to prepare for that final encounter. That would be anointing of the sick. And then, because man's a social being, to sanctify marriage and to sanctify headship in the church.
Oh, certainly.
That would be the reason for the 7 sacraments. And in all of them, they're all instituted to nourish grace, but in different ways, according to these different needs in our supernatural life. So yeah, all the sacraments would be key roles, key means of initially giving and then restoring if we've lost it. That would be the sacrament of penance, and nourishing the life of grace so that it flourishes more every day.
So do image and likeness correspond to the natural and supernatural orders then? Likeness?
We can use it that way. In other words, we don't have to say that that was necessarily the intention of the sacred author.
Sure.
But we can. It's a useful pedagogical tool, and it certainly is there in the plan of God. There's no doubt about that. That a twofold likeness to himself through nature, which remains even after grave sin. In other words, it remains in the sinner who's unrepentant. Right? There's still a likeness. I'm sorry, there's still an image that isn't totally, it's defaced and wounded, but fortunately not totally destroyed, because then there could be no conversion and repentance.
So, quick question here. So is the donum, is it defined, would it be properly defined as the infusion of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity?
Yeah. And understood in the Catholic tradition as flowing from, or I should say in the Thomistic tradition, flowing from sanctifying grace.
Okay.
So sanctifying grace, faith, hope, and charity would all come to us simultaneously. And sanctifying grace, giving, again, I can speak about it, but I can't understand really what I'm saying because of the greatness of the mystery, that it gives us finite human beings some mysterious proportionality with our supernatural end and the divine life. And if that's true, then, and the divine life, God is love, charity flows from grace. In that sense.
So the donum then orders us toward perfect beatitude and reproportions us to attain that end. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to achieve it. Okay.
Right. But obviously, we need to be progressively, so it has to have a beginning, that would be justification, but it needs to grow in us throughout the Christian life.
Yes.
Very good.
Okay.
And that would be, sanctification, progressive sanctification.
Good. Now, I have at least one final question, and it's probably the doozy of them all. But as I'm reading a lot of the literature, reading your two books and reading books by Dario Spezzano and Dominique Legge, trying to get to the bottom of these issues on Beatific Vision specifically, we've been speaking a lot about participation, and that's not just a vague word. That's a very specific and technical metaphysical word almost that has some significant meaning. And to my understanding, reading Thomas himself and also reading these excellent secondary authors or authors of secondary literature, my understanding is here in the Beatific Vision, we participate in the divine essence. So it's not a different God. We're participating in God. We become partakers of the divine nature if we want to read 2 Peter 1:4 in that way.
Right.
But the difference here, because the question here regards the creator-creature distinction, and there's always a proportionality. We never become God himself because he is...
Right.
He subsists. The three persons, the hypostases of the Trinity, subsist in the divine essence, whereas we who have returned to God in reditus, we participate. So I'm wondering if you can help me to understand the metaphysical specifics, the philosophical difference between subsistence and participation, such that participation does not compromise the creator-creature distinction, whereas if we were to say we subsist in the divine essence, that would be a very problematic statement.
Right. Right. So the beauty of divinization is, and so I'm going to add something to your question, and that
Please
would be
do.
the
Correct me.
dimension as well.
Good.
No, I mean that was a great question. So there's we, the creature, right, are brought into this participation in divine life in the aspect of a spousal relationship, right? So it's
sure.
So I want to put in the interpersonal nature of this into kind of in framing the problem, and so our participation in divine nature is that of a spouse or son. In other words, bridegroom, son-father relationship, right? And the beauty of this divinization is that we don't simply replace God, but we're brought into this relationship of mutual self-donation. And in it, though, it remains infinitely unequal, but at the same time, infinitely intimate, so that we don't lose our identity. And there's another phrase in the that used by the fathers like St. Augustine, capax Dei.
Yeah.
So the human being made in God's image and likeness is capable of God, and that's a mystery, right? That's even in some sense, it's the same mystery as grace, that we remaining who we are, remaining with a finite human nature, are capable of entering into this intimate union with God. And already here we're participating, right? So the participation begins with baptism, not we don't have to wait to heaven in the Beatific Vision. So already we're participating in faith, hope, and love, and in heaven we'll be participating in knowing God as he knows himself. And so the mystery is that we can remain who we are and be brought into this union. And that's deeply fitting because it's the union precisely of two who remain two, bridegroom and bride, father and son.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we can speak about it, but we can't. we can't rightly understand what we're saying.
Yeah.
Participation,
Sure.
because it's such a glorious mystery that we remaining human beings can participate in His way of knowing and loving. And that's why there are infinite, because it's a participation, there are infinite grades. And those grades exist in this life, and this is the time of growth. So we're called to grow, passing from one grade, from grace to grace, as it were.
Yeah. Sure.
And in heaven, there's no more growth, but nevertheless, all the blessed will be in different grades of glory. Right? So the humanity of Jesus Christ is the top, the greatest grade, and then Mary and the saints and angels, each in a different place. And so there's a beautiful variety in the heavenly church as there is on earth. And yet, the paradox is that even though we'll be at different grades, each one is full. And
I see. Yeah.
But full with
and it's the divine
different
essence.
capacity.
We're not
Right.
participating in different essences. It's just in different grades.
Right. We're all
but
participating we're all seeing the one word, and we're all participating. And so I added a relational dimension, and I think we can add a Trinitarian dimension as well. And that would be that in knowing God, so the Beatific Vision is a certain sharing. So the Beatific Vision will be seeing the Word directly. The Word. So we'll be knowing the Word as the Father does, as it were. So there's a participation in some very mysterious way in the very procession of the second person from the first, seeing the Word. And in loving, so the life of heaven will be seeing and loving. Right? We'll love totally what we see. And so it'll be the supreme participation in the divine love, which we've already begun here, but will be full in heaven, full each in our measure, of giving back. And so there we're back to the Exodus Reditus, as it were, or better yet, ascending and descending.
Yeah.
So the descending would be seeing. We're receiving, in seeing we receive what we've seen into our minds. And again, that's incomprehensible that the Word can be received in that way. But
so
our response will be right. So that's the mystery of the Beatific Vision. But then that calls for a response, and that response will be the beatific love. And we can see there a certain participation in the procession of the third person.
Third person, charity, right?
As love, right.
So the exitus reditus motif that we see in the Eucharist ultimately goes back to the exitus reditus in the Trinity ad intra, the processions of the persons.
Right, and therefore the life of heaven.
And the link between them is the exitus reditus and the missions, the divine missions.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's built. I mean, it's the eternal life of God, the life of the Blessed Trinity, and so it makes sense that all of His work in creation and bringing us back to Him in redemption will respect those two movements that are linked to the two processions in His eternal Trinitarian life.
Wow, this is fascinating.
Knowing and loving.
Yeah. So I have two very easy questions, Camden, if I can ask them
really
quick.
Yeah, I mean, tie it up after. That's very good.
So as I read Thomas, and I've been reading Thomas all year this year and reading books about Thomas, the best of the secondary literature on Thomas, including your books. What I see is an airtight system. Everything hangs together. Everything fits together just beautifully and perfectly. And I cannot say, as some people would say, that we love Thomas, we just don't like his doctrine of justification, or we don't like his doctrine of the sacraments. We think that's a weakness or an error. And so they want to take Thomas piecemeal and only take some of him. I don't see how that's possible. I think his system is a coherent unit. And so my question is that how you read Thomas?
Okay, great question. I don't think Thomas would have been comfortable with that description, an airtight system.
Oh, wow.
Because, I mean, modern philosophy is, I think, starting with Descartes, Hegel would be the pinnacle of a system. Now, I know that's not what you meant in your question.
Right.
But
right.
St. Thomas is, part of the beauty of his thought is its intrinsic openness, and therefore its constant desire to grow through dialogue with very disparate thinkers, very disparate traditions. And so there's also, at the same time as, I absolutely agree with you. Yes, there's a coherence there. He's trying always to see the whole, and that's proper to the wise man. I love St. Thomas because he so much, to me, embodies wisdom. Wisdom, he takes from Aristotle, the wise man is he who can order all things. But nevertheless, it's an attempt to order that's always opened and growing, and therefore never a system that becomes airtight. And of course,
Sure.
We don't have to always agree with him.
Right.
So I consider myself very much a Thomist, and yet there's some things that I wish he had resolved differently, because I think he didn't always take into account, in each individual case, perhaps some of the great principles that are at the foundation of the overarching coherence. And obviously that's true of every thinker.
Well, thank you. Second really quick question I had was, when I read Thomas and compare his teachings to the Council of Trent, I see full continuity between those two. And I'm wondering if you also think there's continuity, particularly in the doctrine of justification, sacramental theology, and these other things that we've been talking about today between Trent and Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very providential, I believe, that Trent happened when it did from the point of view of developments in Catholic theology. So there was after the death of St. Thomas, Thomism was not thriving. There was a long period. Many of his theses were condemned 3 years before his death. There was then a very opposite movement, nominalism and voluntarism, etc., that dominated Catholic theology for 2 centuries. And it's really with the 16th century that there was a revival of Thomism and St. Thomas's thought, leading in the 50 years before the Council of Trent. But in the Council, there was a great fruit from that Thomistic revival. And in fact, the story goes that the Council Fathers had the Bible, Code of Canon Law, or Decretals of the Popes, and the Summa Theology as their kind of 3 iconic reference points.
Wow.
So yes, I think that's true, that it's deeply, profoundly Thomistic. But again, in that sense of not wanting to, not in the technical sense of where Thomists were divided necessarily from other schools, because the intention of the Council of Trent was not to decide intra-Catholic.
Right.
There was a lot of questions in theology that it's good that they remain open questions, so that we can discuss them, and so the Council of Trent didn't try to decide those in a Thomistic sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But yeah, I think,
good.
yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Very
wonderful. Well, Dr. Feingold, I think Glenn would agree. I think we feel like we owe Kenrick-Glennon some tuition money. But I want to thank you. It's been we love talking about this. This is what we do every week. From a Reformed tradition, we're self-consciously Reformed, but I can't thank you enough for taking 50% more time than you already committed just to speak with us today about these issues. So I encourage you, in your work. Thank you so much for your Thomistic scholarship and for taking the time today to talk to us about it. It's been tremendously sharpening in my judgment. Well,
thank you so much, and thanks for reaching out to me and inviting me.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can
question.
Speak again at another time. But at least for the moment, we do want to let the listeners know. Everything we have going on, you can visit us online at reformedforum.org. There you'll find information about all of our programs and our events. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at mail@reformedforum.org. We want to thank everybody for listening. We hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.